I just want to say we really appreciate you being so open about your life and your family. And I also want to ask for those of us who don't work the front lines during this pandemic. I mean, we'd really love to hear what your experience has been working as an ER nurse, and has have you had any moments that have been life changing or traumatic, or what are some moments that you can share with us?
Yeah, so when the pandemic was actually starting to hit the United States in March, I was back home in Illinois with my dad. And at the time, medical professionals were kind of saying it's not a big deal. It's, the flu kills more people each year. We're going to be fine. We're, the greatest nation. Nothing's going to hurt us. And so I was sitting there in my childhood home and realizing that schools are shutting down, restaurants are closing, and everything's just kind of hitting you at once. And I wasn't at work at the time; I was on vacation, and so I was thinking, what is going on at work? What's happening? We decided it would be best if my dad drove back with me to Illinois instead of me flying back, because at this time there's all this uncertainty. What is happening? Am I going to get it on the airplane? So we drove back and I went back to work. And Denver was probably one of the last um, places to really be impacted significantly. And in the beginning, I felt a lot of fear and anxiety knowing that, my dad was here with me. He's an elder, he's high risk. But my mom had actually passed away a couple of years ago, and he would have been all alone in Illinois. And so we just collectively decided that it would be best to be together as a family during the pandemic. We had no idea how long it was going to last, or the outcome of everything. Definitely didn't anticipate talking about still being in a pandemic today, a year later. So we kind of came out as a family. I went back to work. We were getting information changing day after day. Um, I think the uncertainty of it all was very anxiety provoking for me. We weren't sure if what PPE we were using was going to last us through the entire pandemic. We weren't even sure if it was protecting us. We weren't sure what was going to be most effective. And we weren't even sure what treatments would be best for these patients. It was a brand new disease and virus, and we hadn't had hardly any information on it, which is kind of how we work in an ER anyways. We get patients that just show up and surprise, figure out how to treat it. But this was different because this was impacting so many people across so many countries. And I've been there in this specific ER for going on 5 years now. And when my mom was sick and when I had my daughter, I was able to quit full time, and I worked at a position called registry or PRN. So I just kind of filled in any holes in the schedule wherever they needed me, which was nice to have the flexibility with a new baby. But it meant that if anything were to happen, I would be the first that would be cut. So hospitals started shutting down elective services, which is approximately like 70% of every hospital's revenue comes from elective surgeries and procedures. So people were staying home when they weren't, when they should have probably been seeking medical treatment. I'm sure you've seen the headlines of, people unfortunately dying at home from heart attacks and strokes because they were too afraid to go into the ER. So with this low volume, I was actually furloughed for a couple months. And that was hard for me because it's against my nature to sit back when something's happening. And I just I was torn between wanting to be at work, but also, recognizing that maybe it's a blessing that I'm not there right now because I would be putting my family at risk. So it was just kind of a lose-lose situation for me. And then I went back to work in August, and we had a pretty good couple months. I feel like Colorado has been handling the pandemic appropriately. We've had mask mandates pretty much throughout the entire pandemic, unlike South Dakota. which is just infuriating. And we've been, following the guidelines of medical professionals and scientists. Our governor's very progressive in that sense. So we've kind of had good control over it for a while. And then, fall and winter snuck up on us and our numbers started skyrocketing like they did everywhere else. And just kind of experiencing that worry and that fear again that just really consumed me for the majority of this pandemic. And we started hearing talks about a vaccine. And I think like most people, at first I was like, well, I'm not going to be, a guinea pig for this. They can figure it out. And then I'll see how it goes for everyone else. And I have to admit that before the pandemic and before this vaccine, I didn't really understand clinical trials too much. I didn't understand how they functioned and how much time was spent on each one and what that time was spent doing. And I was lucky that my hospital was very forthcoming with information about how everything rolled out and why this trial has been successfully completed in such a short time frame. And they sent out some information about Operation Warp Speed and discussed how, if we're not in a pandemic, a new medication or vaccine is going to take a lot of time to perfect, because they're spending months upon months trying to get funding for this. They're spending months trying to get volunteers. They're spending years waiting for these volunteers to be exposed to whatever it is. But in a pandemic, and especially with some of the legislation that was passed forth with Operation Warp Speed, this was all able to happen in a really short time frame. So investors were able to fund it immediately because there was no repercussion if the vaccine wasn't successful. Normally they would lose their money. They're kind of taking a bet on whatever medication it is or vaccine or treatment. But this time the government said, we will take the hit if this doesn't succeed. So there was no reason for any company to not help with the funding to make sure it was successful. Likewise with getting trial participants, we're in the middle of a pandemic and everybody is over it and wants it to end. So everyone was jumping at the opportunity. And it was really reassuring to me to see that a lot of these trial participants were nurses, they were doctors, they were surgeons, they were scientists. I'm not sure what my perception was before, but to hear that like my peers and colleagues in the medical field were so confident in this technology that they were willing to be in the trial, and they were the guinea pigs for it all. It had passed safety data, so it was a relatively not risk-free, but a low risk situation for them. But still hearing that it's people in the medical field who are participating in these trials so that we can get out of this pandemic was really eye-opening for me. And then in the middle of a pandemic, you don't have to wait for these people to be exposed to the disease that you're studying, because it's so widespread, especially here in the United States. It's out of control, it's widespread, it's everywhere, it's in every state. So they were able to collect data from these studies in such a short time frame without sacrificing the integrity or the safety of it all. And so in my career, I started feeling more hope, like there's going to be something that's going to help protect me even more, and it's going to happen really soon. And then that happened for me. In the end of December, I got my first dose at my hospital, and so did many of my colleagues. And I worked in the vaccine clinic for a couple shifts, helping to vaccinate the other frontline workers. So we had ER nurses, ER techs, paramedics, ICU nurses, infectious disease doctors, anesthesiologists, floor nurse, COVID nurse. We had so many people coming in, and it was just really, really exciting to see from my perspective all the different people that were lining up for this and saying, yes, I need protection. We need to get out of this as fast as we can. So it's been about 3 weeks since I had my second dose, and my dad has also had the opportunity to get his first dose of the vaccine as well. I was able to get him into a clinic out here, and I know Denver Indian Health was also having clinics for our elders. So my experience now is, it is a lot different than how I felt several months ago. I feel more safe at work. That layer of anxiety is kind of lifted. You know, we're still being very careful, very cautious. We're still using PPE. But it's just nice knowing that you have that extra layer of protection, and especially for my family too.
Wow, that's all really helpful information, things I would have never even thought about. But can you tell us, and I'm hoping you know the two different vaccines, but can you tell us maybe just some slight differences in those two vaccines?
Yeah, so I had the Pfizer vaccine, which the main difference in why one place would offer Pfizer versus Moderna is the storage capacities of the facility that is offering it. So Pfizer has to be frozen at like negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's, not every place has the ability to do that. And the Moderna does not require that. So it's an easier vaccine for smaller clinics and maybe more rural areas to offer. But as far as the differences in how they work, they both use the same mRNA technology, and it's not injecting any virus into you. It's not injecting a live virus or a dead virus, and it's a technology that has been in the works for over a decade now, I believe. They started working on the technology with SARS outbreak, but then the need for the vaccine at the time wasn't needed like it is now. So it helps your body form antibodies to the specific little piece of the cell in the COVID virus. It's called a spike protein. And so your body's building an immune response to that. And between both of them, they're both about, in the trials, their efficacy was both about 95% at preventing COVID infection. And then there were, a small number of people who did end up contracting COVID with a vaccine, but in those participants, I know for Moderna specifically, it was 100% effective at preventing severe disease. So that was really informative for me to see, knowing that you have a very, very small chance at contracting COVID once you've been vaccinated. But if you do, it's not going to be severe enough to require hospitalization, and it's very much not likely to kill you. So my dad got the Moderna just due to what the facility could offer. And, I think if someone's presented with an option to go to a place that has Pfizer or Moderna, I would just say go wherever you can get it as soon as possible. They're both very great vaccines. They've both been studied and shown to be safe for many different populations. I'm also still nursing my daughter, and there's been a lot of discussion about should somebody who's breastfeeding or pregnant take the vaccine. And a lot of different organizations, such as ACOG, which is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, American Society for Reproductive Medicine, several different breastfeeding groups, infant risk, they've all kind of come out with the same statement saying, if it should be offered to somebody and it's their decision on whether or not they take it. These trials, they never include pregnant or breastfeeding women, unfortunately, so there is no data to say one way or the other. It's just purely based off of how they know the vaccine works and any theoretical risk. So as somebody who is exposed to COVID at work every single day, um, the discussion I had with my daughter's pediatrician was that I would get the vaccine and I would continue to breastfeed. And, I've not noticed anything alarming. I know there's a lot of studies underway right now from the breastfeeding and pregnant healthcare workers who have kind of weighed the risks, knowing that COVID infection is significantly more of a risk for somebody who's pregnant than somebody who's not. And so from these groups of healthcare workers, there's ongoing studies, even collecting milk samples from breastfeeding women. So my hope is that they're able to do a quick turnaround with this information that they've gathered from the high risk groups, and will be able to provide more information to others who maybe aren't in that kind of situation where it's such a risk benefit analysis. So when the general population is able to receive the vaccine, they'll have actual information and studies on it.
That was hands down the most informative 10 minutes I've sat through in the last probably weeks of my life. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us and just share what you know. I mean, I think just as a layperson who, my wife works with healthcare systems, so she kind of has more access to information than I say I would. What do you recommend for just everyday people on the ground in terms of who are you trusting, or where should people turn to look for this kind of information? Because I really haven't seen anything similar to what you've just described in the detail and kind of knowledge base that you just did. So what would you recommend?
Well, my dad and I were actually talking about this earlier because he's 71 and he has a couple different health conditions. And I asked him today, I said, have any of your doctors actually called you and told you that there's a vaccine or that you're eligible to get it? And he said, no. And I said, well, that's very frustrating to me because, I'm lucky that I'm in the medical field and I know that the vaccine's available, and I've been calling all these places to get him in. But what about somebody who's not in the medical field? How are they going to know, and where are they going to turn to for this information? So I do think that there is a large lack of information out there from the public health departments. I think, we do have to seek it out, unfortunately, because it's not widely available. But I like turning to local health departments, the state health departments, and the CDC. And I also follow a bunch of very informative epidemiologists and scientists on Instagram. And one of those is Science Sam. It's science.sam. And then a couple other epidemiologists. I can't recall their names right off the top of my head, but I try to share their work often on my page. So I do have a couple different highlights saved on my Instagram with information that is hopefully informative to other people and will help them feel confident when it's their time to make that decision for themselves.
I wanted to circle back quick too to the, when you were talking about the vaccine at the beginning, gave a lot of reasons for why you end up coming to a position of like, I believe in this, I trust this, I'm ready to participate. But definitely started off with this idea of like I don't want to be a guinea pig. And obviously that comes from a long history of the medical field abusing its relationship and its power with communities of color in general. And if you look even as recently as the 70s with Indigenous women in particular, with forced sterilizations in hospitals, there's good reason to be skeptical of this. But the one thing I'm really struck by is just how grateful I am to have such a clear and knowledgeable Indigenous voice sitting here in front of us to be able to share this information and kind of be that. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of Indigenous representation in the medical, in the science fields, to be able to share information as well as building trust with communities that have been historically isolated and abused?
Yeah, I think that for the majority, people in healthcare, unless they're from one of these communities, an Indigenous community, a Black community, a Hispanic community, they're pretty unaware of even the racism that happens every day in the medical system here. They're definitely unaware of things that have happened 30, 40 years ago. And that's very recent for us. I mean, that 1970s forced sterilization that happened to, the generation ahead of me, and people in our families. Like, it's not something that just happened far away in a textbook. So I do really think it's important having this kind of representation to understand where people are coming from. I just read or listened to a podcast by Dr. Darian. He's a Black ER doctor in LA, and his conversation was about reframing the way we talk about it. It's not that the Black community doesn't trust the medical field, it's that the medical field has never proven itself to be trustworthy to the Black community. And that really resonated with me, because that's, what we've experienced also, with additional areas like being promised healthcare and then receiving subpar healthcare, and the forced sterilization and other atrocities that have happened to our families. So, in Denver, we do have a pretty significant Native population. So for me, being an ER nurse, I just feel like I'm glad that I am taking up that space and, hopefully making our Indigenous patients feel a little bit more comfortable. I've experienced that when I walk into the room and there's just like this relief. The majority of my peers are white. So when you're in a situation like that, it's kind of good to know that somebody's in your corner, somebody's going to stand up for you. Somebody's aware of why these fears and concerns exist.
And Cali, I mean, this has been a really positive conversation, so I don't mean to be negative, and I got the vaccine shot myself, but is it true that we just really don't know the very long-term effects of these two vaccines, let's say in 15, 20 years?
Yeah, so one of my good friends talks about this a lot, and I had the same concern as you, especially as somebody who's, hoping to have more children one day. I feel like the two concerns of fertility and long-term effects kind of go hand in hand. And it was really informative for me to learn that of all the vaccines that we have today, those types of long-term effects are almost non-existent. So the majority of side effects happen within 6 weeks of receiving a vaccine. And so the trial's been going on now since March of last year. So that's several months. So that's really reassuring to know that there's not been anything, even in 6 weeks, that has made them say, hold up, let's rethink this. The one vaccine that I can think of right now that has had a pretty significant side effect is the rotavirus vaccine for infants. I believe the schedule is they receive it at 2 months and 4 months. And it was a relatively rare side effect, but it caused something called intussusception, which it's part of the bowel twisting in a way. And, not a fun thing to experience as a result of a vaccine that's supposed to protect you from a GI illness. So that is something that happened, within those 6 weeks. And anything outside of that window has really shown to be extremely rare, and something that is not going to impact the population as a whole. So that was reassuring to hear from my friend who's also a nurse. She compiled a bunch of resources from epidemiologists and people who've been creating the vaccine schedules. And then as far as, my concern was, is this going to impact me having more kids? And I can't tell you where that concern came from. I mean, as an Indigenous person, obviously that probably plays a piece in it, but I've been hearing this concern from people who are not Native as well. And I don't know exactly where that concern came from, because I can't think of any vaccine or medication that has, had that effect. But it was reassuring to see that people in the trial, they were told, please don't get pregnant. But life happens, and people in the trial got pregnant. And, people who have been in the trial have now delivered healthy babies. And people have been getting pregnant in between their vaccine doses once it was released, a couple months ago. So for me, that was really promising to hear that there's been no reason to think that it would have that type of long-term effect on our fertility.
Staying on the vein of like future looking and maybe thinking about fairly big changes in the country around political administration and new people coming in. Thinking about especially someone like Deb Haaland stepping into the Secretary of Interior space. Thinking about even South Dakota local Heather Dawn Thompson stepping in as the tribal relations of USDA. As somebody who's as an Indigenous woman working within the healthcare system who kind of knows the ins and outs, what would be your message if you got to sit down with people making decisions and who had power to make changes? What would you want to share around what your hope for Indigenous healthcare looks like, whether it's IHS or whatever that sort of, you mentioned treaty obligations and that obligation. What would be your message around what you'd want to see change to improve the healthcare delivery service to Indigenous peoples in our country?
Yeah, I think my experience with IHS is very limited since I don't live there and I don't utilize IHS, but I would say that it needs to be a priority for any administration, especially healthcare. This is something that has, been promised and it's not been followed through on, in my opinion, from what I've heard from family members and others. I mean, it's just really disheartening for me to know how many family members I've had that have had significant medical issues and there's nowhere local that they can receive treatment for it. Having to be flown to Sioux Falls and, having to take a bus to Sioux Falls to get blood work done and all this stuff. I mean, it's completely isolated and you don't have the resources necessary, especially when you take into consideration the fact that Indigenous people are more at risk for these comorbidities. I had a discussion with a podcaster once about pregnancy and Indigenous communities. And so I kind of looked into what our risks are as Native women and how much more at risk we are from just not receiving appropriate prenatal care due to inaccessibility. So I think any administration would need to prioritize Indigenous health and well-being. I'm not sure that will happen anytime soon, unfortunately, but I have, that would be my first priority.
Well, Cali, we're coming to the end here. We got about 5 minutes left, but I did want to say that I know you sit in a position where you're able to be surrounded by people who know about these vaccines and the podcasts you listen to, you shared some really good resources. And I just want to say that for someone who lives in a smaller community where we don't have access to that information, I'm really fortunate and grateful that you sat down with us today and gave us that information. So thank you for sharing your knowledge today. I do have not necessarily a question, but we talked a lot about vaccine because that seems to be the hot topic right now, the vaccines. But do you have any, last words of encouragement or positivity that you would like to share with anybody listening, mostly people on the Rosebud Sioux tribe?
Yeah, I would just say that, this is a really kind of unprecedented time for our generation to be living in. And I think I just really sympathize with anybody who's having to make the hard decision right now of, should I get the vaccine or should I not? I think it's a tough position to be in, and it's a hard decision to make. There's worry kind of surrounding either decision, whether you'll be exposed to COVID or whether the vaccine is the right decision for you as a person. So just sending everybody strength in making those decisions. And I hope that whatever you choose for you and your family, that you can do so in confidence and with the most knowledge that you can obtain about it.
Well, thank you again for your time. I'm serious. This felt like a 10-minute show. One of the funnest, one of the most engaging we've done in a while. So I just really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the time that you brought to talking with us today and to sharing. Best of luck with all the many things you do. Whether it's the Indigenous Women Outside, work, whether it's working in the ER, or whether it's just raising a great little girl. Wish you the best and stay healthy, stay well, and looking forward to touching base with you again soon, I hope.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I really hope that one day soon we can maybe all meet in person.
Totally. Absolutely.
Thank you, Kelly.
Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
See y'all. Don't try.